Good evening, bonsoir. I think that's going to be the extent of my French. I one time had to give a talk in Quebec, and I thought I would do my homework, give my presentation, at least my first 5 minutes in French. The problem is the audience asked me questions in French afterwards. So to avoid that mistake, I'll just continue it in English. I am known to talk a bit fast, but Eric has asked me to speak slowly, lentement, s'il vous plaît. So I will try my best to speak slowly here. I do want to talk about rivers and floodplains, but I really want to challenge all of us to think about opportunities for us to really maintain and promote an effective partnership, a partnership that involves citizens, homeowners, business owners, communities, regional organizations like regional planning commissions, and state government, and our federal partners too, because it's pretty amazing. When we talk about flooding, we often talk about flood amnesia occurring and our concern about having only a 6-month window to be able to really effect changes so that we can learn from take these lessons at heart and make some important improvements to ensure that we are, in fact, trying to improve the resiliency of our communities. And it's pretty amazing to see us here today, a good year after the spring floodings of 2011, and not, I guess, 9 months or so later since Tropical Storm Irene, which indicates perhaps a transformation that is occurring to remind us how absolutely as important it is for us as a community working together to try to ensure that there isn't any flood amnesia, that we are in fact learning from these events, and that we can internalize and ensure a stronger, more resilient future. I think we've been talking about flooding for the past day, and we'll continue to talk about flooding and our response to flooding tomorrow. Flooding is our most common form of natural disaster, at least in Vermont, and I dare say perhaps in this region. And the damages that flooding result are usually from either inundation or erosion, or perhaps a mixture of both those impacts. And we see flooding from all year round in this area. It's not just from tropical storms. We see rain on snow events, we see ice jamming, we see high spring runoff events. And so that's our challenge here. It is not something that only occurs at a particular season for a particular reason, but it is in fact real, common, and really challenges us to really think about how are we going to improve our resilience in dealing with both types of impacts. We've talked about erosion being fluvial erosion, or river-based erosion. We have shoreline erosion. So it can occur from smaller events, say the winnowing away of the toes of our rivers and our shorelines, or it can be catastrophic in what we have seen in these larger flood events, catastrophic in that we see channel enlarging or channels even changing direction because of potentially because of the instability of our river systems, or the inability of our shorelines to really handle that type of impact. So it's a real challenge for us to really to get a handle on both inundation and erosion. Interestingly enough, I heard some earlier presentations today that dismissed, say, the problems of erosion because what their community faces is mostly inundation. And I've heard it described in other communities where it's not such of a inundation problem. We're really grappling with erosion. But as we work to trying to manage inundation, sometimes inadvertently we cause greater risk to erosion. And sometimes when we're so focused on erosion and stabilizing the banks with rock armor, we forget what we've actually done is heightened the hazard and preventing some of that energy from dissipating onto those floodplains. So again, it's a real challenge for us to really get our handle around both these impacts and the opportunity for us to work together and be creative in ensuring that we are not trading one for the other, that we're in fact recognizing because of the frequency of these events, we could potentially be faced with either or both types of damages, and it's incumbent upon us to really try to get a handle on how we're going to address those problems. And if nothing else, it's for public health and safety reasons. I think we did experience some loss of life in this last event in Tropical Storm Irene in Vermont. And it reminds us constantly how absolutely it's important for us to think about how we're going to minimize these impacts for no other reason but to enhance public health and safety. I think we've all used this slide over. I think this is a Barry Cahoon original. Perhaps it's a Mike Klein original. But I think this is a high-tech version of the type of impacts we've experienced, flooding we've experienced over the last 20 or so years, or longer, 40 years or so in Vermont. And if we were to update this, we would add the spring floodings from 2011 and the Tropical Storm Irene coverage for the state of Vermont anyway. So it does indicate that throughout the state, we are vulnerable for all types of impacts. The point I want to make here is that there are impacts, but these impacts have real economic consequences. And in fact, this one just tries to capture the costs it took for federal government in partnership for the state to help communities in Vermont recover from flooding. I think since 1989, not talking about the most current 4 floods we've just experienced since 2008, these are floods at a magnitude that warranted a federal declaration. It cost the state something on the order of $136 million to recover from that impact. And those are real dollars. Those are taxpayer dollars. Those dollars are associated with providing public assistance for restoring the impacts associated with public infrastructure. It also does include individual assistance as well, paid for by your federal tax dollars. And that's important here because the federal government does come to our service in providing these dollars, but it's you that are paying for these. And it is your state dollars that are, and local dollars, tax dollars that are paying for those non-federal share or match to those federal dollars. And I don't have the actual numbers from Tropical Storm Irene or the April and May events, but they were pretty substantial as well in terms of the economic impact. This slide, I think, is really helpful because not only does it illustrate the magnitude of flooding and the frequency of flooding that we have seen really since the late 1980s, but it really also demonstrates, as the point I was making earlier, is the economic consequences of flooding and those impacts. And so, again, it would be an argument to try to reduce the impact of our tax burden is taking those steps that will improve the resiliency of our communities, will in turn tend to result in a reduction in that burden it places on our taxes. Well, why is it that we are seeing greater frequency of flooding here in Vermont and perhaps in the region? And there are actually a number of reasons for that. Certainly, we've heard earlier today about the climate shifts that we are currently experiencing today. We've looked at the USGS data, U.S. Geological Survey data, that actually shows increases in precipitation and increases in hydrology in our gauge streams. And we can look at these indicators of these climate shifts, which are significant. But we also have to realize that we have, in fact, decades of instability resulting from past and present decades of channelization practices. And that, too, causes a legacy of channel instability in our streams. I listed here the minimum national flood insurance program standards, and you would probably scratch your head and wonder, why did we add a program that is actually designed to try to improve the resilience at the local level? Well, in fact, the minimum NFIP standards, when a town joins the National Flood Insurance Program, they typically adopt standards into their bylaws, flood hazard standards. And sometimes, unfortunately, for the most part, many towns have adopted only the minimum standards. Even FEMA agrees that these are minimum standards, and we should be encouraging communities to adopt more enhanced standards. But these minimum standards do, in fact, allow an increase in development on these vulnerable areas, these floodplains. So we are, in fact, allowing more and more development in these high hazard zones, these high hazard areas. And as we develop across that landscape, we in fact create a stormwater liability problem. Our receiving waters have to handle the greater quantity that are entering into our receiving waters at higher velocities. And that too has an impact on our channels. we can't go anywhere without talking about what we use these two models to help illustrate the natural balance of streams, and how what we try to do is restore what we call the natural balance, the natural stability, or oftentimes we call it the equilibrium condition of our streams. A stream is considered naturally stable if the inputs are in balance. That is, if it has enough water to move the sediment load, given the slope and the coarseness of the bed and banks, without degrading into its bed or aggrading and filling up with more sediment. But we can do quite a bit of damage if we start fiddling around with this scale. If we say, through greater stormwater running off of our impervious surface, that will cause a reaction to that balance. If we start removing some of that coarse material through channelization or gravel extraction practices, that too will cause an impact to that balance. If we straighten streams, or if we tend to remove some of the vegetation that's providing some of that bank integrity, that too is going to cause some instability. So all these types of actions will set in motion what we call a channel evolution process, which is the diagram you see on your right, where under natural conditions, a stream can maintain its dimension, or its width and depth, and its slope, and its plan form that can manage that healthy slope. But as soon as we start fiddling with that balance of any of those inputs, we see an evolution to occur where you typically will see the channel to either degrade into its bed, or over widen and cause greater erosion of its banks. Given the time and space, a river will restore that natural stability, but that's if you can give the stream the time and the space it needs. So as I mentioned, we have about 200 years of mucking around in our channels, of straightening them, of deforesting our forests that provide some of that flood storage we were talking about earlier today, and all these activities will intend to cause that channel instability. As I mentioned also, we can build under the National Flood Insurance Program in these vulnerable areas, and in fact, we have built in these areas. And in fact, the National Flood Insurance Program is an inundation-only type of tool, where it protects against inundation by allowing you to elevate your building above the flood stage. But here's an example where a structure was actually destroyed from the erosion we talked about, and elevation alone would not have prevented the structure from being damaged or destroyed. Oftentimes we hear, everywhere we go, we hear people talk about how rivers don't move and haven't moved in my lifetime. And so that it made us actually work towards trying to document throughout the state situations where in fact the river has moved, and moved pretty dramatically. And I think this has been very helpful to illustrate to the public how rivers are indeed a dynamic, and in fact, if we are to embrace a new type of relationship with our streams, we need to understand that dynamic nature and how to accommodate for that. And when we do not, when we treat them as static entities, we tend to find ourselves in situations, as these examples illustrate, situations in which there are indeed significant consequences to treating them as static entities. So what's at risk? What are we at risk at losing if we try to ignore the flooding that we just experienced and try to move on with our lives and not really try to think about how do we prevent these types of impacts from occurring? There's a significant amount of risk if we turn our backs to this opportunity. We have risk to our public and private infrastructure, risks to our home and businesses, risks to our farms that are typically adjacent to and near the prime ag soils along floodplains, and risks to our ecosystems as well. It's important to point out, we never before have we seen the value of the relationship between flooding and water quality. And when we monitored the 2001 data for phosphorus in 3 Lake Champlain tributaries, it shows us that 2011 was in fact a significant year in terms of contributing phosphorus loadings into those streams. And when we looked at asked the same question about total phosphorus concentrations throughout Lake Champlain, 2011 once again was well above the mean in those 3 segments. And we all know that the combination of phosphorus with other nutrients, with sediment loadings in shallower warm water, in freshwater can cause some algae blooms that are aesthetically displeasing, potentially toxic, and certainly cause a significant amount of impact to our recreational and economic values we place on those streams. This point I want to make is that it's, we often talk about, when we talk about phosphorus loadings into Lake Champlain, we often think about, okay, is it agriculture or is it urban sources? And this table actually shows, well, that channel instability we talked about, this illustrates that there's a significant amount of phosphorus and sediment loadings actually coming from the instability of the stream channel itself, meaning that we really need to get a better handle on how we're going to manage our floodplains so we can dissipate those erosive forces and allow those floodplains to serve as a means of storing some of this nutrient sediment loadings that are carried during floodwaters. So the importance here is that we have moved as a society away from creating dams and creating levees. Those were very expensive, high maintenance approaches for dealing with flooding and having to manage flooding. We often looked at it in a couple of decades ago, even longer, as a strategy to provide flood control to a community, but it's highly expensive for a small geographic benefit. And we've migrated into around what we call mitigation, that is actions we take to mitigate the impacts or avoid those impacts from flooding. And those two are important, but we really need to think about is how we are going to manage risk. We all live with a certain amount of risk in our life, a certain amount of uncertainty, and we know that if risk equals probability times consequence, that it's highly probable we're going to see future flooding. How can we minimize the consequences? And there are a number of important steps we need to take to get that risk down to a level where we can tolerate as a community, as a society. We can look at our bylaws and ask ourselves, have we provided a mechanism that can provide a greater protection at the local level? We need to encourage people who are currently in these vulnerable areas to secure flood insurance. We need to continually educate the public. We need to look at preparedness, adopt mitigation planning and avoidance strategies, and we need to look for opportunities where they arise to actually remove structures from these areas. So I have 3 slides I want to share with you to illustrate this partnership I talked about. This slide talks about ways communities can actually adopt a flood resilience in what they do. And I pose this as it's a pretty long list here, but all of these things are an effort for the community to buy down that risk. First and foremost, adopting flood and fluvial erosion hazard bylaws is absolutely important for you to, as a community, to recognize that dynamic nature of the river and accommodate both the inundation and erosion hazards that are posed by flooding. We need to look at how we're going to recognize the natural and beneficial functions of our floodplains, our river corridors, our vegetated shorelines, our wetlands, that will provide for flood hazard mitigation, public safety, and other water quality benefits. They become your services that you can achieve from those natural features of your landscape. We need to look at our road and bridge standards and adopt. In Vermont, we have the most recent road and bridge standards incorporated into what I call the Orange Book, the Handbook for Local Officials. Towns need to adopt these anyway, know where they are, and look at those road and bridge standards contained in there. What is contained in this edition are the stormwater-related road and bridge standards that help mitigate the stormwater impacts to flooding. And we need to look at how to adopt stormwater management practices and perhaps look at potentially adopting some ordinances that can support the infiltration of our stormwater before they become a stormwater liability that we would then need to shunt through a sewer system and treat at the end of that pipe. And we need to look at whether and how we have vegetation along these riparian areas in our floodplains and look for opportunities to provide that filtering capacity that these buffer areas can provide. And in fact, because of the flooding and the significance of our response to continuing to channelize our rivers after large flood events, we are in fact have created a partnership between local and regional entities and our sister agencies to look at our operating procedures on how we manage channels, stream channels themselves before, during, and after flood events. And we'd like to involve local communities through trainings and workshops to get these practices adopted into local practices. Why do we talk about stormwater? It's because 2/3 to close to 3/4 of our rainfall are still within that 1 to 2 inch rainfall event. And that poses a really important opportunity for us to think about stormwater and how we can encourage greater infiltration of our rainwater at the site, again, before they become a liability that we would then have to manage and treat, an expensive liability indeed. And what can citizens do? We can promote infiltration of that rainwater by disconnecting that runoff from your own rooftops. You can install vegetative buffers for enhancing that bank integrity and provide shade and important water quality benefits. We can encourage, earlier we talked about how absolutely important it was to continue to educate our youth. And in fact, someone had mentioned that something on the order of 47% of science teachers across the country are unclear as to whether climate change is really happening and what the reasons are for climate change. I mean, that is discouraging. We need to flip those numbers around and recognize how important it is to enhance the environmental literacy of our youth through programs like SWEEP, which is the statewide education programs. And we need the local landowners to support the adoption of these flood resiliency bylaws. What is the state going to do? Well, we're here to support that. We have model bylaws for both flood hazard bylaws that are above those minimum standards. We have fluvial erosion hazard bylaws. We have stormwater bylaws that we have worked in partnership with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to develop. We can provide technical and educational assistance through our tactical basin planners and our natural resource staff. And we can provide through the ecosystem restoration grants and through other grant programs we manage, we can provide some federal financial assistance to help accomplish some of these objectives. Most importantly, we have an opportunity to really look at what kind of incentives are we providing communities, and can we align our incentives with what we need to achieve here. And we're really looking at a way, what we call, in lack of a better terms, I guess, a community flood resiliency program, where we will actually help to enable communities to take advantage of some of these bylaws and this technical assistance with the objective of achieving a long-term resilience. And in fact, you would get points for taking those steps. And those points would relate to a greater opportunity to receive some of the grant programs that we manage. Why are we doing this? We want to develop a whole different relationship with our rivers and our shorelines. And here's a real opportunity for us to do that, where we can enhance our public safety, minimize these economic costs, provide a low-cost alternative, and have healthier river and lake ecosystems in the long run. So thank you very much.